Hi, everybody. Thank you all for tuning into today's Coffee with a Survivor. We're excited to have Aggie Day with us. Aggie, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, this said something about entering admit. All right.
No worries.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to share my story with you. And so, my name is Aggie Day, and I'm a hidden child. And today I'm going to talk to you about the journey of my survival. These are just introductory pictures of which you'll see during my presentation. So my family history begins in Hungary on my mother's side only. On my father's side, he was Serbian from Belgrade. What was at the time Yugoslavia. Here you see a picture of my grandparents on their wedding day. And this is a picture that I have of my mother when she was 2 years old. And I show this picture because it's fun to see what the styles of a 2-year-old were at the time. And my mother's birth certificate. Now, I was born in Belgrade, which at that time was Yugoslavia. Today, of course, it's in Serbia, the capital, and it was then the capital of Yugoslavia in 1940, May 13th, 1940. And when a Jewish girl is born, after 8 days, it's customary to name her officially with her Hebrew name in a synagogue. And my parents did that. And the synagogue they were in was here, a picture of it. And I always, before I started my presentation and doing research on my presentation, I always thought that the synagogue I was named in was a very small synagogue in Belgrade, and that it had been destroyed during the war. I was very surprised during my research that that was not the case. In fact, it was this synagogue, which I found on the internet, Belgrade Synagogue, and it is a very large synagogue, as you can see, very large. In fact, it's the largest in Belgrade. And to my surprise, it was not destroyed. So I did write to them, but they verified that they had the records of my naming. Is a picture. This is my birth certificate, and in Belgrade and in Serbia, of course, they use the Cyrillic alphabet, which is different than the alphabet that we use, which is the Latin alphabet. This is just a postcard picture of Belgrade in 1934. And you can see it's a very sophisticated, large city. Of course, there's 320,000 people when I was born. It's really referring just to the center of the city, not any of the neighborhoods and so on. But Belgrade is the capital. It is a sophisticated, very large city. Okay. Now, in 1941, in May, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia. The war had started, of course, in 1939 when Poland was invaded, but Belgrade was invaded in May 1941. And here's a picture of the German soldiers, some German soldiers advancing. And this, of course, is unfortunately a reminder of what's happening today in the Ukraine. And very, very quickly, the Yugoslav soldiers did not fight back. In fact, they surrendered very, very quickly. What happened to my parents at that time, and I'm not sure exactly of how long it took after the invasion, my parents received a knock on their door, and there were a couple of Nazi officers, I don't know, 2, 3. And basically what they said is they told my parents they had to get out of their home immediately, maybe an hour, 2 hours, I'm not sure. To me, this has always been something that I find astounding. Now, we were living, my father, my sister, who was 12 and a half years older than me, and I was a year old, and my mother. I don't know how my mother did it. My mother was an extremely lovely person, very persuasive, charming, and she somehow persuaded these officers to let us stay in the apartment, in the maid's room. And she, for that, offered to cook and clean for them in her home. To me, that's astounding and unimaginable. To somebody imagine coming to your home, saying you have to get out of your home, and then you're offering to clean for them and cook for them, and you're in this little room with your family, just so that you have a place to stay. And they're using your things that were precious. As we know, all of us have precious things in our home. Well, basically, that's what my mother did, because when you have a situation where you're being thrown out of your home, you think very quickly, which is what she did. Of course, when that happened, immediately my parents realized they had to get out of there. My mother was in touch with her mother, who lived in Budapest, Hungary, which is about 196 miles north of Belgrade. And for whatever reason, this was apparently not happening in Budapest. So my parents tried and were trying to get out of Yugoslavia to go to Budapest. They tried all sorts of ways. My mother tried to hire cars, tried to go on bus. Nothing was available. Finally, they started on a march. They took suitcases and they left. I remember my sister telling me a story. She was only 12 at the time. By that time, I'm sorry, she was 13. And I remember my sister telling me that she found a little cart, and she there were stores that had been abandoned, all kinds of stores, clothing stores, jewelry stores. They'd just been left because people were fleeing. And when you're fleeing for your life, nothing is important except food. No material possessions are important. Imagine leaving jewelry stores abandoned, clothing stores abandoned, everything abandoned. And my parents just left and started to walk. And my sister found this little a candy store and a little cart, and she loaded that cart up with candy because that was food. So our journey began in Belgrade. You see here, there's the border between Hungary and, which is now Serbia. Now, Yugoslavia at that time, all these, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, here is Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, all these were incorporated into what we called at that time, what was called Yugoslavia. They started to march. They found this little, they wound up in this little village just on the border, near the border. And it was a town occupied by, at that time, were known as little towns that were occupied by Orthodox Jews. And they took a respite there for a few days. And the rabbi, the head rabbi there, invited them to stay and just to stay and be safe. And they were fed, and they took a few days. And after a few days, my mother woke up and said, "We have to leave immediately." And they tried to convince her, "Oh, no, it's fine. Just stay. You're welcome to stay here. You'll be safe." And my mother decided absolutely not. And they went on to Budapest. What they heard a few days later was that that town was totally annihilated by the Nazis. So my mother had a sort of an ESP, revelation, whatever, dream, and felt she had to leave. And that, of course, saved our lives. Now, why were things different in Budapest than in Belgrade? Because in Belgrade, they were rounding up all the Jews the way they were in many of the other cities in the world and in the eastern part of the world, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and taking the Jews and started to taking them to concentration camps, death camps. And why was Budapest different and safer? Well, in November of 1940, this man here, Miklos Horthy, he was an anti-communist leader, and he allied himself with Hitler. And in Hungary, in June 1941, Hungary had declared war on the USSR. So basically, he was very much anti the USSR, Russia. And although he was a big anti-Semite, he decided that Jewish people who were of Hungarian background would not be taken to concentration camps. They would remain in Hungary. Now, in August of 1941, Hungary started deporting Jews without the Hungarian citizenship. This included my father, my sister who had been born in Hungary, my mother, and I, because I was a baby of my mother's Hungarian national heritage. We were safe, but my father was not. And basically my parents were living and hiding in my grandmother's apartment. Also in December of 1941, Hungary entered the war against the Allies because they were allying themselves with Hitler and Germany. So then they became enemies of the Allies. Who were these allies? France, the United States, not quite yet, but later, the USSR. So these were the allies, and Hungary was an enemy of those allies. Then, when I was about 2 years old, there was a neighbor, and somebody decided to inform on my parents, on my father basically, that he was not Hungarian. My parents were called in front of the Gestapo. They were issued a letter, and they actually went to the building in downtown Budapest. And luckily enough, my mother ran into an old friend of hers from high school, and he couldn't believe what she was doing there. And he asked what she was doing there, and she said they had been asked to report. And he said, immediately turn around, run, and get away from here, and make sure that your husband, my father, disappears, because that will be the end of you. Well, my first memory is actually when I was 2 years old, and my father that night actually left, and he went into hiding into the countryside. And I remember standing at the door and crying. And that was then. And then my sister, my grandmother, and I were left. Now, what was going on in Hungary at the time? Well, the young men, although they weren't sent to concentration camp and to their death, the young Hungarian men were sent to work camps. 27,000 Jewish men died in those work camps. They were beaten, they were worked to death, they were starved. And here's a picture actually of my uncle, my mother's brother. And as you can see, he's in this work camp, and he did survive. And then in March of 1944, Germany and the Admiral Horthy broke up, and Germany came and actually occupied Hungary. And they took away the protection of the Jewish people to be deported to concentration camps. And the Arrow Cross Party began a rule which was even worse than the Gestapo, and the Hungarian Jews started to be deported. This is a small town, the kind of town I was telling you about on the border where my parents had stopped. And here are these Jews being told, pack up a little bag and you have to come through. And here they are actually walking to the train station where they were being deported to the concentration camp. Of course, they did not know that. They were just listening. What is surprising at the time is by that time, the world really knew that there were concentration camps, and the world really knew what was happening. And yet somehow it had never reached the ears of the people in Hungary, because here are these people, instead of trying to fight or not go, they're following like little sheep, and they're following and obeying. Now, of course, a lot of it is fear. However, they should have, at that time, at least some should have tried to escape, which apparently they didn't. Sorry. So this is in May of 1944. In fact, actually, the Hungarian Jews were the last to be deported among all the Jews that were being deported in Europe at the time. And they were the last that were. And the Nazis very, very quickly tried to do this in a big hurry and gather all the Jews they could of Hungary onto death marches. In fact, so much so at that end that a lot of the concentration camps were actually being opened up and released. The Jews were being released. And the Germans were frantically trying to get the Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz to kill them all. Well, when the news of this came in Budapest, my mother realized we had to do something. And she realized that we had to go into hiding. Now, she heard about this priest who had been hiding some people, Jewish people, and she contacted him, and he told her he couldn't help her because the people that he was hiding and where he was hiding them, he just had no more room. A lot of people who were told things like that, some would just accept that and try and do things on their own. My mother did not accept that, and she kept after the priest and after the priest. She did not take no for an answer. And she said, you have to help us, you have to help us. Now, at one point, I do remember that we were in a hospital and I was in a crib and we were hiding in a hospital. But that was only for a few days. Like I said, my mother kept on with the priest, and finally, he told her he had a place for her and my grandmother and my sister in a convent where they would be dressed as nuns. My sister would be dressed like a novitiate, was a nun in learning, but there was no room for a 4-year-old. However, he found a couple in his parish, and he found a couple that agreed to hide me. And they pretended that I was their cousin who came to visit them from the countryside. And they changed my name. And that's what they told me that my name was, and that this is what I was to say. Now, these people took their lives into their hands. They had no children. They were a young couple. Because had they been found out, of course, they would have been killed. What was happening in Budapest at that time is the Allies, and of course the United States were part of the Allies by that time, they were bombing Budapest because, remember, Hungary was an enemy of the Allies. Now, in big cities, I think many of you are aware, in the big cities, people live in apartment buildings in Europe. And a lot of these apartment buildings had cellars. And every time there was an air raid, which was a warning that the Germans were coming to bomb the city, people had a system set up whereby people would go into the cellars, and they had a system to make sure that everybody in the building was going to be there and hidden. I mean, hidden, yes, hidden in the cellars, protected, in other words, during the bombing. And that's exactly what was happening. So every time there was an air raid, and to this day, I still remember the siren, which was very, very frightening. People would go to the cellars, and the people I was with were always, must have been very afraid, because here they told this 4-year-old, don't talk to people, don't do too much talking. They were very afraid. Can you imagine if I would have said that not that I knew anything about being Jewish, but that I wasn't who I wasn't their cousin and so on. Basically, they had to trust this little 4-year-old, and they were very, very brave to do this. And with them, I was there for a number of months. Now, but actually before I was put with these people, we were hidden by the priest in his apartment. And he was living in an apartment house, in an apartment, and he was living alone. And he hid us in his apartment for about 6 weeks or so. And during that time, I was told only one person could walk at a time so that no neighbor would realize that there were more than one person living there, in other words, the priest. And also that we were not to talk and only talk in whispers. When I present this to young children, or the classes that I present to, I often say to them, can you imagine when you're telling a 4-year-old to be quiet or to walk one at a time, or later on to say that I'm their cousin and so on, which is very unusual because usually when you tell a 4-year-old something and they're told to keep it a secret, what does a 4-year-old right away do? They say, I have a secret, I have a secret. It's very hard for children to do that. However, children of war are very different than children of peace. They really do what they're told. They're afraid. There's a fear that is hard to describe, but it's there. And they just listen and do what they're told. So back to the couple that I was with after I don't know how long, they decided they were going to leave and go to the countryside because there was more food in the countryside than in the city, in Budapest. And what I remember then is that I was at the train station with them on the platform, and I remember being absolutely terrified because they were going to take me with them and I would never see my mother again. As we're standing there, and I'm scared, but not saying a word, because remember what I said, children of war, unlike children of peace, they don't cry, they don't say, I'm scared and so on. They listen and they do what they're told. I do remember standing there with them, and all of a sudden, it was like a miracle to me. The priest that was hiding my mother and my mother came, and they came to get me. They had, of course, been told about their plans to leave, and they had made arrangements for me to go to another family. But nobody had bothered to tell this little 4-year-old that it was okay, that she wasn't going to be taken away by these people, that her mother would come and would rescue her, more or less. Anyway, right away, I was put with another family or couple, and I was told the same routine. And so it went. My time with the two different families was 9 months. And then the war ended. Now, basically, the tragedy of the Hungarian Jewish population was that in Hungary in 1941, there were 825,000 Jews. And by 1944, after the Normandy landing, 564,000 Hungarian Jews had died from starvation, from murder, from gassing, and most of them died in Auschwitz. Of the third of the Hungarian Jewish population that survived, basically most of them were hidden in Budapest or in the big cities, in convents, in private homes, and in hospitals. And there were some safe houses that were set up by a Swedish diplomat, Raoul Wallenberg. And these safe houses were declared Swedish property. And they took some Jews in there, created false passports for them, and they were able to save them in that way. But imagine that in 9 months, just 9 months, 564,000 people died in a very, very short time. Remember, I said the Nazis were absolutely desperate to get rid of the last group of Jews in a very, very short time. 1945, Russians occupied Hungary because the war had ended. Victory. And the Russians, of course, were one of the allies. And they came marching into Budapest. And what I remember from that time is I remember being with a couple, and I was told that I would be with my mother very soon. And that's what the war ending meant for me as a 5-year-old. And what I remember is we were standing on the street and there was a big march. The Russians were marching in victory. And I was very excited because I was going to be seeing my mother very soon, and my sister and my grandmother. Well, what was interesting is that the people weren't cheering as the march was going through at all. They were not cheering. It was very quiet. And I remember, which is very strange, I think, for a 5-year-old to remember, is that I was sort of surprised. Why wasn't everybody excited like me? Well, of course, the reason was that the Russians were communists, Soviet Union, and Hungary had been a democracy. And now they were being occupied by communists, and they knew that the country was going to become a communist country, which would mean the lack of freedom of a democracy. Here's a picture of my mother and my sister and me in Budapest during the Russian occupation. Somehow, my father, who had been in hiding in the countryside, was able to get a hold of my mother after a while and after we reunited. And since there was very, very little food in Budapest, my mother decided to send my sister, who, as you can see, is an adult there, 17, and she decided to send us to Budapest, out of Budapest, to be with my father in the countryside because there was food in the countryside. And what I remember from that time is we were put on a barge, on a cattle barge, and it was November, and we were in, really, it was cold November, and we were wearing heavy winter coats. And I remember all of a sudden we're on this cattle barge and we were told we were moving left and right. Basically, they had overloaded the cattle barge and it capsized and we wound up in the river. My sister, luckily enough for me, was a very, very good swimmer. And she had this huge rucksack that was holding our clothing. And she had me in one arm because I couldn't swim. And then somebody actually pulled my head. Somebody was drowning, pulled my head. She was grabbing onto me into the water, which left me with a fear of the water for quite a while, you can imagine. And my sister, unfortunately, had to kick her away. There were a lot of people that drowned that night. And she swam to the other side. Farmers took us in, clothed us, and we spent a few days with them. My mother heard about this accident. Of course, there was no communication, especially in this day and age. We're so used to cell phones and immediate communication. There were no phones even working at that time, nothing. But she found out, she must have been terrified, and finally found out we were safe. And we did reach my father, who happened to be, there were all these Russian soldiers, I remember, and they were very happy to see this little girl because, of course, they had been separated from their families and they hadn't seen their children for many years. So I remember learning Russian songs and learning some Russian words, actually. And after, I don't know how long, my sister and I went back to my Budapest, and my father managed to escape, and I'm sure it was with the help of these soldiers. I'm not sure why he was there with the soldiers or anything like that. It was never really explained to me, and I probably didn't ask enough questions. I know I didn't. And my father escaped into Austria, and he went to Vienna, and we went back to Budapest. Well, as I said, the communists had taken over the government over slowly. It started to become more and more a communist country where you're told to do things and there's no democracy. My father and mother were in touch with each other by mail, but finally my mother decided that as much as my father had tried to get us out legally, and he did very hard, she said, we had to get out of there. We had to really escape from Hungary. And so that's exactly what we did. We left Budapest and went to the border. We were trucked to the border, and at the border there's this Lake Neusiedl, and basically we went during the night in a huge rowboat. And I remember we were told to be very quiet because there were people ready, again, the Russians. If there were people escaping, they would just shoot us. And I was told that, and of course I was 6 at the time, 6.5, I'm not sure exactly. And we went in and out of the bulrushes every time there was a noise of any kind. But we did make it, and we wound up on the other side of the border in Austria. And there we were met by people, and taken by truck to Bad Gastein, which was a small town, and it was a DP camp. And for some reason, I'm sorry, but the slideshow is not working the way it's supposed to. But anyway, a Jewish displaced persons camp. And Bad Gastein and Hofgastein, it's a little twin city and resort place. And Bad Gastein is full of spas, and Hofgastein is a place for skiing. And Bad Gastein also has this little waterfall, which is surrounded by a bunch of hotels. And that's where the people who were put into displaced DP camps, displaced persons camps, were put. And there were about 2,000 people in Bad Gastein. And we were put into these hotels, which were of course empty because they were luxury hotels that had been used before the war of people going to resort. And I remember that the waterfall, that I couldn't fall asleep for a number of nights. So we must have maybe been very close to the waterfall in one of these hotels. I hadn't gone to school before that time. So of course I had to learn German because that's what you speak in Austria. And this is my first report card. And I was 7 years old at that time. And we were there for, I don't know, a year, maybe, not even that time. My sister had met a GI, American GI, and she got married. And then we left the Bad Gastein, the DP camp, and we went to live in Salzburg, which was not very far from Bad Gastein. Salzburg, Austria, picture of Salzburg, very lovely. And actually my sister had a son, my nephew, and I was 9 years old and very proud to become an aunt at the age of 9. And we lived there for about 2 years, a year and a half, I'm not sure exactly. And then my brother-in-law was given orders to go back to the United States. And so of course my sister and he and my nephew, that's where the plan was to go. And so when my mother found that out, she said, well, we'll just follow, of course. Now, what happened in the meantime while we were living in Salzburg, basically my father and my mother really were estranged in terms of not living together. He lived in Vienna. I saw him a few times or during the year, but basically he visited us and we visited him in Vienna, but they were not living together. And my mother made plans that she thought we could follow my sister, her daughter, and found out that we couldn't. And the only way that she could go anywhere was to Canada. Now, people at that time, this is 1949, America, they didn't really understand the difference between the United States or Canada. Everything was North America, which is, of course it is. And there wasn't really an understanding that Canada is a different country than the United States. And somehow people in Canada allowed, from Toronto, they allowed some Jewish people to come as long as they were guaranteed, the Jewish organizations in Toronto guaranteed to take care of these Jewish people, that they would allow Jewish refugees to come to Toronto financially. So my mother found out about this and applied and found out she could come, but I couldn't. And she had to come to Toronto, Ontario as a housekeeper. And she had to basically be there for a year and work there, and could not take me. So my parents made an arrangement that I would go and live with my father to Vienna. And as soon as my mother could, she would get me to come to Toronto. Now imagine, I loved my father, but I didn't really know him. I had not ever lived with him, but it wasn't a matter of questioning. It was, or me questioning. That's what I had to do. It was very scary for me because I had to say goodbye to my mother, but I did know my father a little bit, and I got to know him very well. And luckily for me, they were wonderful times. My father and I had a wonderful time. I went to school. Here's a picture. Actually, this is me. And I do remember a lot of these particular people in this classroom. So it's amazing what memory can do. So I live with my father. We're constantly in touch with my mother, of course, by mail. And I always knew, as much as I loved my father and had a wonderful life in Vienna, which we did, or I did, I always knew that when my mother was ready to send for me, that I would be going to live with my mother. And after about 2 years, when she had finished her job for a year and then she got a job, she was able to show that she could support me, and she sent for me. This is a very difficult time for my father and me, because I had to say goodbye to my father, whom I had learned to love very much. And we had to say goodbye to each other. And then the only way that the governments or were allowing me to travel to Canada was as a refugee. And even though my father had a good business in Vienna, and he would have been able to send me privately, he was not allowed. I had to go as a Jewish refugee. And so we had to say goodbye in Vienna and I had to go to Bremerhaven, which is in Germany, which is where we were to meet the ship that was to take me to Canada. Now, this journey is only 622 miles from Vienna to Bremerhaven, and about the same from Seattle to Boise, Idaho. But this was, as I said, sponsored by the International Refugee Organization. And basically this voyage took 5 months. Now, why did it take 5 months? It took 5 months because intermittently I was put into these orphanages because I was a refugee, and this was the way it was. And I was stayed in certain orphanages some weeks, some months, and it took 5 months. So it was a very difficult time because I was alone. I had no one that loved me, and just orphanages. We wound up in Bremerhaven in 5 months, and there we were waiting for the ship. And on my papers, I found the name of the ship remember I told you about my research on the internet, where I'd found the synagogue. And in my papers, I had found the name of the ship. And lo and behold, I found a picture of the ship on the internet. And here's the ship that I actually was going to embark on, the Anna Salem. Now, this was a ship that had been used during the war for soldiers, transporting soldiers. And so it was still set up that way instead of as a liner with cabins. And it had a huge, huge room. I was taken there and had 2 huge rooms where one was for women to sleep in and one was for men. And I was taken to this couple and I was told, if I have a problem, just go talk to them. And basically that was it. And I was alone on the ship. It was a very rough voyage. And I remember being quite ill on the ship. And this journey lasted 9 months, where we stopped in Halifax. For 9 days, I was really by myself. and very ill. And then they put me on a train. Now, the one thing that was very luckily for me is that there was another little girl my age, and she was put on the train beside me, because as it happened, she was going on the same direction as me, actually to a town called London, Ontario, which is about 100 miles past Toronto, Ontario. And they put us together, and that journey, although it was only 1,100 miles by train, because it was a slow train, stopping at many places, took 3 nights and 2 days. And the conductors, when they took their shifts, were all very nice to these 2 little girls who could speak no English, who had a little pocket with their names and an ID in front with some money. And they bought us food at different stops, or when the conductors came on. They purchased some pillows, because basically we sat up for 3 nights. And finally, we arrived, and I was told to get off. And I got off on the platform with my suitcase, and I was looking for my mother. I spoke no English, and I didn't see my mother. I don't remember the feelings, but I'm sure I must have been scared. But everybody seemed to be going in one direction. So I just followed along. And then everybody seemed to make a little turn to the right up this little ramp. And again, I followed along, and suddenly I saw my mother. Well, you can imagine how excited I was. It's interesting because many times I, as an adult, have thought about that time and thought, what if something would have happened to my mother on the way to the train station? I spoke no English, and I had this ID, and I didn't even have an address where I was going, nothing. So it must have, I've often thought, what would have happened to this little girl had, God forbid, something happened to my mother? But anyway, that's just a thought I've had over the years, being a mother myself and so on. Now here are just some pictures of my identity. Of course, I was fingerprinted. And here you can see, this is how I found the name of the ship, the Anna Salem. So I lived in Toronto. I learned English. I went to school. I got married, and I gave birth to my daughter there. And then when I was 28 years old in 1968, we moved to Montreal, because my husband had to finish a residency. He was a doctor. And then I gave birth to my son in Montreal, and we lived there for 10 years. And after 10 years, the opportunity came for us to move to Seattle, which was very far away because, of course, the opposite ends of the country. And I've been lived here since then. From 1978, I've been living here. And this is just a picture of my family. And here's my nephew, the one that was born in Salzburg. And we're visiting him because he does live just outside of Toronto now. This is my daughter, her son, and my son and his wife, and my granddaughter and my grandson. This is me and my grandson, him, and my granddaughter. What I would like to leave you with are these words. From John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, given part of the address that he delivered, graduation address. If we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we all are mortal. Thank you so much for listening to my story. And I believe now we're going back to Sierra, right?
Thank you, Aggie. It was great. I've got a couple questions for you.
Sure.
Let's see. The first one is did you stay in contact with the family that you were in hiding with at all?
No, there were two families, and no, unfortunately not. However, stayed in contact with the priest, and actually, so after, after everything was over and so on, for the first few years, no, but after that, my mother went back to Hungary because her brother stayed in Hungary. And later on, my mother was able to bring my uncle to Canada on many visits. Especially when he was older, the communists didn't mind the older people going. There was a restriction there. And she actually brought the priest over for one summer with him. So we did stay in touch with the priest.
And how much do you remember from being in the DP camps? Is it a lot of
Where?
the displaced person camp?
Well, you saw a picture. I didn't actually point out to it. You saw that picture of me dressed in the costume. Do you remember that? No? Yes or no?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, that actually, I'm wearing we're doing a dance. It was a big, like I said, 2,000 people. So they had arranged for school and so on. So what I remember is just nothing really traumatic. I participated in dance. I had friends. I went to school. What happens was interesting when people have memories, especially memories where a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, very young children, memories that are actually stay in a person's mind are very, usually, unfortunately, not really great ones. They're the traumatic memories. They're the bad memories. The good memories are sort of part of life. And that's so often why people don't have very good memories when they're young. So my memories stand out because of the ones that were not so great. So what do I remember of the DP camp? Just going to school and having friends. That's basically it.
And kind of building off of that and being so young, then what was it like as you got older and learned and understood more of what was happening?
But what do you mean by older and understanding what was happening?
As you got older and learned more about what went on, did your perspective, I guess, of
So you mean once I was in Canada and understood?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, first of all, I learned about being Jewish. I never knew about what that meant. I didn't even know any. I had no affiliation with any kind of a religion because for my parents and the trauma of what happened, I guess they wanted to shield me. So I learned about being Jewish, and my mother was very interested in me becoming and understanding being Jewish. And so I learned my Jewish heritage, and I learned that these brave people, Christians, Roman Catholics, saved me. I was very, very grateful. And at that time, it was interesting. There were many times that I heard, of course, people were very much anti-German at that time in the 50s. And I remember being very angry and saying, non-Jewish people helped me, Christians saved my life. And that was so important to me. And of course, I started understanding what actually had happened in Germany at the time. So it was just all a learning experience, and knowing that I was very grateful of these very brave people who took their lives into their hands to save me and many other Jews, not just me.
There's two questions that actually kind of tie together. So what happened to your dad in Vienna after you left him, and did you see him again after that?
That's always a question that's asked. Sadly, of course, we kept in contact all the time. He became sick in about when I was about 13 or 14. And I remember my mother had remarried. And I remember my stepfather was a doctor, and they sent him all kinds of medicines from Canada. And of course, we were in constant touch. And we had planned to go, my parents had planned that I would go back and visit him. And that never took place because he did become sick and more sick, and he died when I was 16 years old. So sadly, I really only got to live 2 years with my father knowing him, loving him. And they are wonderful memories, but that's all I have. And the other sad thing for me is that I really know nothing about my father's background. And this is very sad.
Yeah, that is unfortunate.
It is very unfortunate.
Another thing I've got is you were a teacher, correct?
I was.
What kind of led you to that profession? Just curiosity.
Well, as a teenager, when I was about, I think, 16, I started going to camp. I was a counselor at day camp, then I was a counselor at a going away camp. I eventually, I got over my fear of the water when I was about 8 and became very avid swimmer. I wound up being head of a waterfront at camp. They were all Jewish camps. I loved working with children, and it was a very natural thing for me to become a teacher. That's what I wanted to be. So it's very interesting because for me, when I present to the classrooms, it just feels like I'm doing that again. So I love it.
And then I guess, when did you start sharing your story, and what kind of brought you to that point?
That's an interesting thing because the Holocaust Center has been around for quite a while. And it took me a long time to actually agree to do this. And I've been sharing my story for about 6 years. I was asked over 10, 11 years ago. And at that time, it was too difficult for me to do that. And it took a lot of convincing for a while for me. Sharing my story is interesting in that it does bring up emotions for me that sometimes they touch me, and sometimes it's maybe a little bit, it affects me emotionally, let's put it that way. And I think it's very, very important for people like me, for Holocaust survivors, to share our stories. And so that's the reason actually that I realized there aren't that many of us left. I'm one of the youngest survivors because I was born in 1940. Unfortunately, and I'm old, we're losing more and more actual Holocaust survivors. I know that you, and certainly the Holocaust Center in Seattle, have second generations people sharing their stories, or even third. And so it's important to have people like me. And I know the people I present to, a lot of them are classroom students. They appreciate the fact that they're actually able to talk to someone who was there at that time, even though it was very young.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have right now. So I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Nice to see you, Sierra. Goodbye, everyone.